The courtroom was crowded.
Mm-hmm. And this was in West Point?
This was in West Point. And so everybody was going to be charged, and we were going to be sent off to jail. We were boycotting the merchants because we didn't have black people working in the stores. The first place we boycotted was the Kroger store, which used to be right at the edge of Cottrell Street as you come to downtown. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. And so I wanted to know on my study, what made Mississippi black people in the 1960s? We had lived under Jim Crow all of our lives.
What is Jim Crow?
Jim Crow is if you know anything about history, C. Van Woodward wrote this book, said, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a set of laws, the black code systems, a set of laws that prevented you and I from having equal opportunities for education, for employment, to drink out of the water fountain, to be seated in the waiting room when we visit with the doctors, not having to, you had to step off the side of the street. You knew your place in society in the South if you were a Mississippian. And that process is called enculturation. So I wanted to look at the enculturation process of the people in West Point, and I wanted to look at another concept in anthropology that is referred to as cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is when another culture comes in contact with the one that's unfamiliar. They bring in new ideas, new technology, if you will. As humans evolved from the over-tube, we went into making other kind of technologies. When we started to domesticate animals, we invented fire. So a community or group of people is known based on their technology, their ideas, and how they adapt and I won't use the term assimilate, because we had already assimilated after we had came over as slaves. We spoke the language, we copied some of the Puritanic ways, and we were really entrenched because your parents would tell you, don't get out of place. We don't want to see you hung. We don't want to see you in jail, or you come up missing and we don't know where you are. So that's what Jim Crow was.
Well, were black people afraid, or because of the threats on their lives back in West Point, Mississippi, or were they encouraged because they were discriminated against? Were they encouraged? Did you find that those people who stood up, like the Howard Guns and like the people that you mentioned, what inspired them to push? And we don't know enough about them.
The culture diffusion.
Yeah, we don't know enough about them like we do the Fannie Lou Hamer. You know.
For an example, now I was married to John Buffington until the day he died. I married John in January of '68, and he died in March of '95. And before, I always thought, and I'm sure John must have told me this, that he was the first person to come to West Point. But Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was under the leadership of, it was John Lewis, Julian Bond, and then Stokely Carmichael came. Then you had the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You had the Corps for Equality, another group. You had the Black Panthers. You had the Black United Front. You had all of these various organizations. We, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating people, we were more radical than the SCLC. King wanted to be nonviolent, and Stokely Carmichael said, if you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. And so we were more radical in that sense. And so were we scared? Scared to death. I remember my daddy. If you lived in Mississippi in a town like West Point was a company's town. Either you worked for the Bryant Brothers Packing Company, or you worked for the Sykes Lumber Yard that did the sawmill stuff. If you worked in these two places, then chances are you lived in their houses. So you reported to them. I can recall my daddy's boss from Bryant Brothers coming to our house trying to talk my mama into letting daddy come back home after daddy done cut up and went off on the weekend and clowning around with his chicks.
So they come in and try to put the family back together?
They had to. Mama wouldn't let him in.
Oh.
But and so out of all of this, my daddy would say to us, don't go up to be messing around with them civil rights workers, I'm gonna lose my job, or your house would get burned down. People were terrified. absolutely terrified. You know, there were burnings, and I can recall times my oldest child, my daughter, Terry, and I crawling around on the floor where the Klansmen were shooting in the Freedom House. And so it was a time to be afraid in Mississippi. You have to understand that anytime you move into a society that is in dominant control, you become a threat once you started to rise up. We could never possibly, we probably could have, but had it not been for these young people that came from around the United States.
The Freedom Riders?
The Freedom Riders was out over in North Carolina
Okay.
that integrated the Woolworth counties and stuff.
Okay.
These young people came, that's one man that I interviewed, I thought my husband was the first one to come to Mississippi, but he wasn't. He was sent to a nearby town in Columbus, so we had these spot houses that these civil rights students that from Syracuse, Yale, Harvard, George Washington University, Stanford, they were from black institutions. They were from everywhere. And so one of the men that came before my husband's name is Eddie Brooks. Eddie now lives in Tupelo. Eddie came to Mississippi in 1962. They were into these communities, but they were quiet. Nobody knew they were there. Mm-hmm. Now, we had the NAACP, Mr. Jack Jackson and David Gilp and Mr. the great men from down in Tibet, Charlie Gray, them, and all of these, Jack Jackson, all of these people were quietly working on the scenes because the NAACP didn't come to West Point until the 50s. That was under Mr. Jack Jackson's leadership. And so Eddie Brooks, when they came to West Point, I didn't know this until I interviewed him recently. They lived on 5th Street down from the high school, mm-hmm. and lived in the house with Bishop, God, what his name has escaped me. But he was,
no.
Eddie Long wasn't born back in those days. His name is on the tip of my tongue, but he was the Methodist bishop. Mm-hmm. The Methodist church in the black community played a unique role than the Baptist churches. They are more sophisticated, if you will, in the Baptist churches. Played a dominant role.
Okay, more so than the Baptist.
Absolutely, in those early days. Mm-hmm. And so this pastor took these civil rights workers in. It was Bob Gillum, he was from Chicago, David, this young man that I'm talking about, Eddie Brooks from Chicago, but they were 17 years old, mm-hmm. coming to Mississippi, scared to death. And so
But they should have been, shouldn't they?
Everybody was scared.
Yeah.
And so now remember now, in '62, we were watching Meredith trying to integrate Ole Miss when the riots and the National Guards were called out. I was in the 11th grade, and I will never forget how we were all glued around the television watching it, scared to death, because civil rights was in the air. It was the blow of the wind. It was just a matter of time before it reached all of these little isolated communities. And so when one of the civil rights workers from Chicago went back to another location, Eddie Brooks and another guy, Dave Lorenzo, he was from Chicago, but he also was a writer for Jet magazine. Mm-hmm. They went to the nearby town of Columbus and kidnapped Buffington and brought him to West Point. And when Buffington came, it was the first Freedom House, because he established the first Freedom House. They were unable.
And what did you do in the Freedom House?
That's where all of the civil rights workers from around the country that stayed in West Point lived there. It was bunk style, mm-hmm. and it was right on Carter Street, 2 houses up from my home. Yeah. And I had to go by there to get to the store. There were 2 white stores in the community, Mr. Anderson and Mr. Wittry's. And so your parents would send you to the store, you get a dime worth of sugar. And so on the way up to the Freedom House one morning, I've always been an inquisitive kind of person. I stopped and looked in the mailbox to see who all lived there, because my daddy had forbidden my brother and I to go there. And as I was looking in the mailbox, this man came out and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm trying to see who lives here." And I ended up marrying this man.
Oh my goodness.
My daddy didn't know that. Okay. But I would sneak off, and we would go when Stokely Carmichael was elected chairman, because I was a SNCC girl. Stokely Carmichael was elected chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee after John Lewis stepped down. And it was up in Shaw, up in the North Carolina, and Stokely stood up that night and hollered, Black Power. It was 10 of us.
And that's the beginning of Black Power?
That's the beginning of Black Power. And it was 10 of us in the car that night. Me, Joel Bernard, Johnny Wilson, and Evelyn, John Buffington, me, and I can't remember who the other people were, but the car broke down coming back. Holy cow. And I was scared to death my dad was going to miss me because I had been gone a long time. And so I was there, but my daddy never knew that, because you were not allowed, because there was this fear. Imagine losing your job in Mississippi if it was the only thing there was a meat packing company on the